Chapter 181. November 8, 1892. The day had finally arrived. Across Amarathia, millions of citizens headed to polling stations in cities, towns, and rural communities. Election day was in full swing, and the nation buzzed with anticipation. The race for the presidency had been fiercely contested, with Matthew Hesh facing off against veteran Senator Howard Grayson and a few other contenders. Polling stations were packed from dawn to dusk. Factory workers cast their votes before starting their shifts. Farmers traveled miles to participate, while dock workers and shopkeepers formed long lines, eager to have their voices heard. Campaign posters and banners adorned every major street corner, many of them bearing slogans like "Hesh for Progress" and "A New Era for Amarathia." Matthew and his team gathered in a large conference room at the campaign headquarters. The atmosphere was tense as results from various states began to trickle in. Large maps of the country were pinned to the walls, each one marked with key battleground states. Amber stood by his side, reviewing reports from campaign advisors. "Early results are coming in from the East Coast," she said. "Grayson has taken New York and Connecticut, but we're ahead in Pennsylvania." "Sylvania's steelworkers are with us," Matthew replied. "If we win there, that'll give us a significant boost." General Carter Hayes, who had joined the campaign as a security advisor, approached with a cup of coffee. "It's going to be a long night, Governor. You fought hard for this, but the race is closer than we expected." "I knew it wouldn't be easy," Matthew said, crossing his arms. "Grayson's been in politics his entire life. People trust him to maintain the status quo. We're offering them something different. Change. That scares some folks." Hayes nodded. "Well, from what I've seen across the country, you've got the working class behind you. That counts for a lot." By 9 p.m., the election map was divided almost evenly. The eastern states had largely gone to Grayson, while Matthew dominated the industrial heartland, securing Ohio, Sylvania, and Illinois. The battle now hinged on key states in the Midwest and the Western Territories. A campaign aide burst into the room. "We just got confirmation Kansas and Nebraska have gone to Hesh." Cheers erupted among the staff. Amber smiled, squeezing Matthew's hand. "That's a good sign. The farmers came through for us." Matthew allowed himself a brief smile. "We've got momentum, but it's not over yet. California and Texas are still in play." At his own headquarters in Amsterdam, Senator Grayson paced nervously. His advisors were equally on edge, despite strong support in the eastern states. They hadn't expected Matthew's campaign to perform so well in the Midwest and South. One of Grayson's aides approached with a grim expression. "Sir, it's looking worse than we thought. Early reports show Hesh gaining traction in California. If he takes that, he'll have the electoral majority." Grayson clenched his jaw. "How is this possible? He's an industrialist, not a statesman. People see him as a problem solver." The aide replied. "They believe he'll bring real change to their lives. Read exclusive chapters at Novelbin." Calm Grayson muttered under his breath but said nothing more. He knew the odds were no longer in his favor. By midnight, the election reached a fever pitch. Both candidates were neck and neck, with only a handful of states remaining to report their results. The entire nation held its breath. Matthew's campaign room fell into a tense silence as the latest update came through. "California has been called for Hesh," a campaign manager announced. The room erupted. In cheers and applause, staffers hugged each other, tears of joy streaming down some faces. The realization began to dawn on everyone: Matthew Hesh was on the verge of becoming the next president of the great Amarathian Republic. Matthew stood silently for a moment, letting the news sink in. Amber approached, her eyes shining with pride. "You did it. You're going to be president." He exhaled deeply, a mixture of relief and exhilaration washing over him. "We did it, Amber. All of us. But this is just the beginning. Now comes the hard part." At 1:30 a.m., the final results were confirmed. Matthew Hesh had won with a narrow margin, securing a majority in the Electoral College. News spread rapidly across the country. Crowds gathered in city squares, celebrating late into the night. Fireworks lit up the skies in Chicago, Pittsburgh, and San Francisco. In a historic speech broadcast by radio and reported in newspapers, Senator Grayson conceded the race. "I congratulate Matthew Hesh on his victory," Grayson declared. "The people of Amarathia have made their choice, and I respect their decision. I trust that Governor Hesh will lead this nation with integrity and vision. By early morning, Matthew addressed the nation from Chicago. Thousands of supporters filled the streets outside campaign headquarters, waving flags and chanting his name. Standing before a sea of faces, Matthew began his speech. His voice was steady but filled with emotion. My fellow Amarathians, I am deeply honored and humbled by the trust you have placed in me. This election was not just about politics, it was about the future of our nation. Together, we have chosen progress, innovation, and opportunity. The crowd roared in approval. Over the past months, I have traveled across this great land. I have listened to your hopes, your struggles, and your dreams. You have told me what matters most: your families, your livelihoods, and your communities, and I promise you this. I will not forget those conversations. I will not forget the trust you have given me. He paused, letting the applause die down. Our journey is only beginning. We face challenges ahead, but I have faith that together, we will overcome them. We will build a future where every Amarathian has the opportunity to thrive. This is our moment. Let's make history together. The crowd erupted in cheers once more. Amber stood nearby, watching with pride as Matthew waved to the people who had propelled him to victory. As dawn broke, the campaign staff celebrated their hard-earned victory. Messages of congratulations poured in from around the world, including foreign leaders who recognized that Amarathia was now a global power under Matthew's leadership. But Matthew knew the real work lay ahead. The nation's expectations were high, and he intended to deliver on every promise he had made. For now, however, he allowed himself a brief moment of reflection. He stood on the balcony of his hotel suite, watching the city of Chicago come alive with celebration. Amber joined him, resting her head on his shoulder. "You're going to change the world, Matthew," she said softly. He smiled. "Not just me. We all are. This is our time." Chapter 182. March 4, 1893, Washington, D.C. was alive with celebration. Tens of thousands of Amarathians flooded the streets to witness history. It was a cold but clear day, perfect for an inauguration. The crowd stretched from the Capitol steps down Pennsylvania Avenue, waving flags and holding banners that read, "Hesh for Progress," and "A New Era Begins." Matthew Hesh stood in a room near the Capitol Rotunda, adjusting the cuffs of his tailored suit. His mind raced as he mentally prepared for the monumental task ahead. He was moments away from being sworn in as the president of the great Amarathian Republic, despite the weight of the occasion. He remained composed. Amber approached him, her expression calm but supportive. She gently straightened his tie. "You ready for this?" Matthew smiled softly. "As ready as anyone can be for something like this. I've been through industrial takeovers, international negotiations, and battles over territory, but nothing quite compares to leading an entire nation." "You've earned it," Amber said, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You have the vision, and you have the people behind you. Just remember why you're doing this." "I haven't forgotten," Matthew replied. "This is for the future for all of us." A knock at the door interrupted their moment. General Carter Hayes entered, wearing his full ceremonial uniform. "Mr. President-elect, they're ready for you." Matthew took a deep breath, nodded, and turned to Amber. "Let's make history." The inaugural platform had been constructed on the east steps of the Capitol. The Supreme Court Chief Justice stood at the podium holding the Bible that would be used for the oath of office. Members of Congress, former presidents, military leaders, and foreign diplomats filled the platform, their eyes fixed on Matthew. As he ascended the steps, the crowd erupted in applause. People waved their hats and cheered, their voices echoing across the city. For many, Matthew was a symbol of hope and progress, a leader who had transformed territories and industries and who now promised to do the same for the nation. Amber took her seat among the dignitaries, watching with pride as Matthew stood before the Chief Justice. "Please raise your right hand," the Chief Justice said. Matthew raised his hand and placed his left on the Bible. "Repeat after me. I, Matthew Hesh, do solemnly swear." "I, Matthew Hesh, do solemnly swear." Matthew repeated firmly that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the Great Amarathian Republic. That I will faithfully execute the office of President of the Great Amarathian Republic. And will, to the best of my ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the Republic. and will, to the best of my ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the Republic. Congratulations, Mr. President, the Chief Justice announced. The crowd roared as Matthew lowered his hand and turned to face the sea of Amarathians. For the first time in his life, he was not just a businessman, innovator, or governor, was now the leader of the nation. Matthew stepped up to the podium. The crowd slowly quieted as they waited for his first words as president. He took a moment to survey the audience, his gaze steady and determined. My fellow Amarathians, he began, his voice resonating across the platform. Today we stand at a crossroads in history. We have achieved incredible progress built by the hands of farmers, workers, inventors, and dreamers, but I know that many of you still face challenges. You worry about your livelihoods, your children's future, and the changing world around us. He paused briefly, letting his words sink in. I am here today to tell you that we will meet those challenges head-on. Together, we will build a nation where opportunity knows no boundaries, where education, innovation, and hard work open doors for all. We will invest in infrastructure that connects our communities, in industries that create prosperity, and in policies that protect the rights and dignity of every citizen. The crowd responded with cheers and applause. Matthew continued, his tone growing more passionate. We will not retreat from the world. We will lead through trade, technology, and diplomacy. Our strength lies not in isolation, but in cooperation and progress. And to those who doubt our resolve, let me be clear, Amarathia will not falter. We are strong, we are united, and together we will forge a future brighter than any we have ever imagined. He ended his speech with a final, rallying call. This is our time, Amarathia. Let's rise to the occasion. The audience erupted in applause, chanting his name. Fireworks were launched from the nearby hills, marking the historic moment. As Matthew stepped down from the podium, he shook hands with several dignitaries, his mind already turning to the work ahead. The inaugural parade showcased the diversity and strength of the nation. Floats representing different states, industries, and military units moved down Pennsylvania Avenue. Marching bands played patriotic tunes, and schoolchildren waved from decorated carriages. Matthew and Amber rode in an open carriage, waving to the crowd lining the streets. People cheered and threw confetti, their faces filled with excitement and hope. Despite the cold, the atmosphere was electric. You've won them over, Amber said, smiling at the enthusiastic crowd. Let's hope I can keep their trust, Matthew replied. Winning an election is one thing, governing is another. You'll do fine, she reassured him. You've already proven that with the northern provinces. After the parade and formal events, Matthew finally arrived at the White House. The transition team had prepared his office, and key staff members awaited his instructions. His chief of staff, Henry Collins, briefed him on immediate priorities. Mr. President, your schedule for the next few days includes meetings with Congress, foreign ambassadors, and key industry leaders. We also have the infrastructure bill draft ready for your review. Matthew sat behind the resolute desk, taking in the weight of his new responsibilities. First things first, Henry, I want a full update on the economic recovery plans. Infrastructure, education reform, and workers' rights are my top priorities. We need to hit the ground running. Understood, Mr. President, Collins replied. Amber entered the office and handed Matthew a cup of coffee. I thought you might need this. Thanks, he said, smiling gratefully. It's going to be a long road ahead, but we've got momentum on our side. As the day wound down, Matthew took a moment to gaze out the window at the city below. The lights of Washington, D.C. shimmered like stars, a reminder of the countless lives depending on his leadership. Explore more stories at RanoVox. This is it, he murmured to himself. Time to get to work. Chapter 183. Explore stories on RanoVox. April 10th, 1893. The presidential residence was calm that evening, a rare reprieve from the constant meetings, briefings, and decisions that consumed Matthew Hesch's time. For once, the noise of politics was distant. In their private quarters, Matthew found peace with his wife and newborn son, Maverick. Amber sat in a cushioned rocking chair near the large window, cradling Maverick gently in her arms. The baby stirred, letting out soft coos as Amber whispered soothing words to him. The warm glow of the evening sun bathed the room in amber light, making the moment feel timeless. Matthew stood near the bed, silently watching the scene before him. He admired Amber's tender care, her motherly instincts shining through with every gentle touch. Her hair, tied loosely, framed her face, and her eyes sparkled with warmth as she gazed down at their child. You're amazing, Matthew said softly, breaking the silence. Amber looked up and smiled. It's not exactly a difficult job when he's this calm. Give it a couple of years when he starts running around and causing trouble, she teased. Matthew chuckled and approached, kneeling beside the chair. They'll be right there with you when that time comes. We'll handle it together. Amber leaned forward slightly, allowing Matthew to place a gentle kiss on Maverick's forehead. The baby stirred again, his tiny hands reaching out instinctively. Matthew took one of Maverick's hands in his own, marveling at how small and delicate it was. "He's perfect," Matthew whispered. Amber nodded. "He is, and he already has your determination. You should have seen how hard he cried when the nurses first wrapped him up. He wasn't happy until they gave him space to move around." Matthew smirked. "Sounds like a hesh, all right, we don't do well being constrained." Amber laughed softly, shifting Maverick slightly as he began to fall asleep. "You've had a long day," she said, glancing at him. "You should rest." Matthew shook his head. "I've waited all day for this. Everything else can wait." They sat together in silence for a while, enjoying the simple, peaceful moment. It was a rare treasure in a life filled with responsibilities and expectations. A gentle knock at the door interrupted the stillness. Matthew stood and crossed the room, opening the door to reveal Charles Grayson, Amber's father. The older man had traveled from their hometown to visit, and while he carried himself with dignity, there was still a look of awe on his face as he stepped inside. "Mr. President," Charles greeted with a grin, extending a hand. "Charles," Matthew said, shaking his hand firmly, "you know you don't have to call me that in private." "Old habits die hard," Charles chuckled. "Besides, it's still a bit surreal. I keep thinking back to when you were just a commoner working from a train station, and now, here you are president of Amarathia." Matthew smiled, stepping aside to allow Charles further in. "It's been a long journey. I wouldn't be here without you. You gave me opportunities when others wouldn't even look my way." Charles waved his hand dismissively. "Nonsense, you earned everything you've achieved. I just gave you a nudge." Amber stood and approached her father, cradling Maverick in her arms. "Hello, Papa," she said warmly, leaning in to kiss his cheek. "Amber," Charles said with a smile, his eyes softening as he looked at his daughter and grandson. "And this little one. I can't believe I'm a grandfather." Amber gently held Maverick out so Charles could see him better. "Meet your grandson, Maverick Hesh." Charles took a deep breath, blinking away the emotion that welled in his eyes. He reached out and carefully touched Maverick's tiny hand. "Hello, Maverick," he whispered. "You've got quite the legacy ahead of you, young man." Matthew watched the interaction with a sense of deep gratitude. Family had always been important to him, and seeing Charles bond with Maverick filled him with a renewed sense of purpose. "How have things been back home?" Matthew asked as they all took seats in the spacious living area. "Busy, as always," Charles replied. "Your factories are running at full capacity. It's amazing to see how much the town has changed because of you. People have jobs, their children are going to school. And there's a sense of pride in the air. You've given them hope." "That's good to hear," Matthew said, "but there's still so much more to do. This presidency, it's overwhelming sometimes. The expectations are enormous." Charles nodded thoughtfully. "Leadership always is, but you've already proven that you can handle it. Just remember to take care of yourself and your family. They're what keep you grounded." Amber smiled at her father's words. "He's right. You don't have to carry everything on your shoulders, Matthew. You have people who can help." "I know," Matthew replied quietly, "and am grateful for all of you. I wouldn't be here without you and Amber." Charles chuckled. "You've come a long way from that ambitious young man who dreamed of changing the world, but one thing hasn't changed. You still believe in a better future. That's why people follow you. Never lose sight of that." They continued talking for a while longer, sharing stories of the past and discussing plans for the future. As the evening deepened, Charles stood to leave, giving both Amber and Matthew one last hug. "Take care of each other," Charles said as he headed for the door. "And keep making us proud." "We will," Matthew promised. After Charles left, Matthew and Amber returned to the nursery where Maverick lay peacefully asleep in his crib. Matthew leaned against the doorframe, watching Amber adjust the blankets around their son. "He's got a big name to live up to," Amber murmured softly, brushing a hand over Maverick's hair. "He's going to do great things," Matthew said, "just like his mother." Amber smiled at him and his father. Together, they stood in the quiet room, watching over their child. For all the challenges ahead, this moment belonged to them, a reminder of the strength they drew from each other and the future they were building together, no matter how many battles lay ahead. Matthew knew that with his family by his side, he could face anything. Chapter 184. April 20th, 1893. Matthew Hesh sat at the resolute desk, a pile of documents stacked neatly in front of him. Today was a critical milestone in his presidency. After weeks of planning, deliberation, and countless meetings with his cabinet, the time had come to take direct action. His signature would set into motion a series of reforms aimed at improving life across Amarathia. Henry Collins, his chief of staff, stood by the desk, briefing him on each decree. Several members of the press were stationed outside, eager to report on the ambitious series of executive orders the new president would be signing. "Mr. President, these are the initial decrees," Henry said, handing him the first document. "Each one addresses one of your key campaign promises. Matthew nodded and picked up the first decree. He glanced over at Amber, who stood near the entrance of the office with General Hayes and other advisors. She gave him an encouraging nod. "Let's get started," Matthew said, dipping his pen into the ink. The National Infrastructure Development Decree. This decree authorizes a massive investment in the nation's infrastructure, Henry explained. It includes funding for roads, railways, ports, and bridges, particularly in rural areas that have been neglected for decades. Matthew read through the decree carefully. It laid out a plan to build over 10,000 miles of new roads and expand key rail lines to improve the transport of goods and people. The decree also prioritized the modernization of major ports like San Francisco, Baltimore, and New Orleans. Infrastructure is the backbone of progress, Matthew said, signing the document. Without it, we can't connect our industries or support rural economies. As he finished his signature, Amber smiled proudly. She had seen how much this project meant to him. The National Education Reform Decree. The next document focused on education. This decree mandates the establishment of public schools in every state. Henry said it also includes funding for teacher training programs and updated curriculums that emphasize science, engineering, and the arts. Matthew's mind drifted to his childhood when education had been a privilege reserved for the wealthy. He knew firsthand how knowledge could change lives, and he was determined to make it accessible to all. "Every child deserves the chance to learn," he said. "Education is the key to opportunity." He signed the decree, envisioning a future where young Amarathians would have the tools to build a better world. The Workers' Rights and Safety Decree. Henry handed him the next document. This one addresses labor conditions. It sets national standards for workplace safety, limits working hours to 8 per day, and introduces protections against child labor. Matthew nodded in approval. His visits to industrial centers had shown him the brutal conditions many workers endured. Injuries and deaths were common, and children often toiled in dangerous factories. "This will save lives," Matthew said, signing the decree. "Workers are the backbone of this nation. It's time we treated them with the respect they deserve." General Hayes, standing nearby, spoke up. "You're going to face resistance from some industrial leaders on this, Mr. President. They'll claim it's too expensive." Matthew looked at him firmly. "Let them complain. They've profited off the backs of their workers long enough. If they can't adapt, they'll be left behind." The National Healthcare Access Decree. This decree establishes a network of public health clinics in underserved areas, Henry explained. It's designed to provide basic medical care and reduce the spread of preventable diseases. Matthew thought of the families in rural areas who had no access to doctors. Illness often meant death for those who couldn't afford treatment. "No one should die because they can't get basic health care," he said. He signed the decree. Determined to reduce mortality rates and improve overall health across the country. The National Resource and Energy Policy Decree. The next document outlined a plan to develop Amarathia's vast natural resources while promoting sustainability. This decree focuses on managing our oil, coal, and mineral resources, Henry explained. It also includes funding for research into alternative energy sources. Matthew knew the importance of this decree. His experiences in the northern provinces had taught him that resource extraction needed to be balanced with environmental responsibility. Overexploitation could destroy entire regions. "We'll build a future that's both prosperous and sustainable," he said. He signed the document, hoping that future generations would benefit from these policies. The Immigration and Trade Decree. Find your next read at novelbin.com. This one is about trade and immigration. Henry said it modernizes customs facilities, strengthens trade partnerships, and creates a clear path for legal immigration. Matthew had seen the bustling ports of San Francisco and Amsterdam. Immigrants were vital to Amarathia's growth, bringing skills, labor, and innovation. However, the system was disorganized and often corrupt. "Immigrants built this nation," Matthew said. "We're going to make sure they're treated with dignity and given opportunities to succeed." He signed the decree, knowing it would shape the future of Amarathia's economy and culture. The National Defense Modernization Decree. This decree focuses on strengthening the military, General Hayes explained. It includes funding for modernizing equipment, expanding the Navy, and improving logistics for national security. Matthew had seen the devastation that war could bring. He knew that Amarathia needed a strong defense, not just to protect its borders, but also to maintain stability in an increasingly interconnected world. "Peace is built on strength," he said, signing the document. "But we'll never use that strength recklessly." The National Civil Rights Protection Decree. The final document in the stack addressed civil rights. This decree enforces protections against discrimination, Henry said. It guarantees equal rights for all citizens, regardless of race, religion, or background. Matthew knew this would be one of the most controversial decrees. Tensions around civil rights were high, but he refused to back down. "We're one nation," he said firmly. "Divided, we fall. It's time we lived up to our ideals of equality and justice." He signed the decree, knowing it would be a long and difficult battle to fully implement these changes. As the last document was signed, Henry gathered the stack of decrees. "It's done, Mr. President. The press is waiting for a statement." Matthew stood and adjusted his jacket. "Let's give them something to talk about." He stepped outside to address the press, flanked by Amber and his advisors. Cameras flashed, and reporters leaned forward, eager to capture his words. "My administration is committed to building a stronger, fairer, and more prosperous Amarathia," he declared. "These reforms are just the beginning. Together, we will create a future where every citizen has the opportunity to thrive." The reporters bombarded him with questions, but Matthew answered each one with calm authority. He knew that the road ahead would be challenging, but he was ready to lead. Chapter 185. May 3, 1893. The White House was quiet as the sun set over Washington. Most of the day's meetings were finished, and the staff had retired for the evening. In a secluded part of the residence, Matthew Hesh entered a private workshop designed specifically for him. Amber had jokingly referred to it as his sanctuary of invention. Though Matthew's duties as president consumed much of his time, he never forgot where his passion lay: creating and innovating. Tonight, he was focused on an idea that had been percolating in his mind for weeks. The room was well equipped with tools, electrical components, and various prototypes from his previous projects. He moved to a workbench where several diagrams were laid out. These were plans for technologies that did not yet exist in Amarathia but could revolutionize communication across the world. Radio and television. Matthew had long known the importance of communication. The telegraph had changed the world by transmitting messages quickly over long distances, but it was limited to text. He envisioned something far more powerful: devices that could transmit sound and, eventually, images across vast distances. If successful, these inventions could connect people in ways never before imagined. He began by focusing on radio technology. Matthew sketched the core components of a radio system. He knew that at the heart of any radio device was a transmitter capable of sending electromagnetic waves, and a receiver that could convert those waves into audible sound. His diagram included an oscillator circuit to generate a high-frequency carrier wave, a modulator to encode voice or music onto the carrier wave, an antenna for transmitting the signal over long distances. Your journey continues at Novelbin. A receiver circuit equipped with a detector to extract the encoded audio from the transmitted signal. He gathered components, including copper wire, capacitors, resistors, and vacuum tubes. The vacuum tubes, though still in early development within certain laboratories, were essential for amplifying weak electrical signals, a critical step for long-distance radio communication. Matthew soldered connections and assembled a prototype transmitter. Once it was complete, he turned his attention to the receiver. He muttered to himself as he adjusted the tuning circuit: "The signal needs to be strong but not overpowering. We'll need to broadcast on different frequencies to avoid interference." After hours of testing, he finally succeeded. He connected a microphone to the transmitter and spoke into it. "Testing 1, 2, 3. The words crackled through a speaker attached to the receiver across the room. It wasn't perfect, there was static, but it worked. He smiled, knowing he had taken a significant step forward. Amber entered the workshop carrying a tray with coffee and snacks. "Still working?" she asked, setting the tray on a nearby table. "You know me," Matthew said, grinning. "I can't help myself, but you're just in time to witness something new." He demonstrated the radio prototype, broadcasting his voice from one side of the room to the other. Amber's eyes widened in amazement. "Matthew, that's incredible. You're telling me you can broadcast sound over long distances with this?" "Exactly," he replied. "Imagine being able to send news, music, and speeches across the entire country without needing telegraph lines. Farmers in rural areas, sailors at sea, anyone with a receiver could stay informed." Amber nodded thoughtfully. "This could change everything. You could bring the entire nation together through information." "That's the plan," Matthew said, "but I'm not stopping there." Matthew spread out another set of diagrams. This time, the technology was even more ambitious. Television. He had already conceptualized a system that could capture and transmit moving images using a scanning technique. "Amber, picture this," he began. pointing to his sketches, not just sound, but images, moving pictures broadcast to homes. Families could watch live events, news reports, or entertainment without leaving their living rooms. Moving pictures? Like a theater at home? Amber asked, intrigued. Exactly, but instead of film reels, the images would be transmitted through radio waves. It'll take time to perfect, but I know it's possible. The design called for a camera that could scan an image line by line, converting it into electrical signals, a transmitter to send those signals, a cathode ray tube CRT display to recreate the image on a screen. Matthew worked late into the night. Sketching and refining the design, he would need to collaborate with scientists and engineers to develop the necessary components, particularly the image scanner and display screen. Amber placed a hand on his shoulder. Matthew, you're going to change the world again, you know that, right? I hope so, he said quietly. This isn't just about technology, it's about people. A farmer in Kansas could hear speeches from Washington, a worker in Pittsburgh could see the world beyond their factory. And children could learn from teachers hundreds of miles away. This technology can unite the nation in ways we've never dreamed of. In the following days, Matthew discussed his plans with key advisors, including Henry Collins and General Hayes. This is groundbreaking, Collins said after reviewing the radio prototype, but how do you plan to implement it on a national scale? Well, start by establishing government-supported radio stations in major cities, Matthew explained. These stations will broadcast educational programs, public service announcements, and national news. Well, also encourage private companies to create entertainment content, music, theater, storytelling. And television? Hayes asked skeptically. That sounds like science fiction. It's further off, but he'll have teams working on it, Matthew replied. For now, the focus is on radio. Once the infrastructure is in place, television will follow. A month later, Matthew hosted a public demonstration of the radio technology at a government event in Washington, D.C. Journalists, business leaders, and members of Congress gathered in a large auditorium standing before the crowd. Matthew spoke into the microphone connected to the transmitter. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, you are about to witness the future of communication. His voice echoed through speakers positioned throughout the hall. The audience murmured in awe for the next hour. Matthew and his team demonstrated how the technology could broadcast music, speeches, and even emergency alerts. The press coverage the following day was overwhelmingly positive. Headlines read, President Hesh unveils new age of communication. Radio to connect the nation. The voice of Amarathia. A technological revolution. As the weeks passed, construction of radio stations began across the country. Matthew's workshop remained a hub of innovation, where he and his engineers continued refining both radio and television technology. His dual role as president and industrialist gave him a unique opportunity to shape the future. Late one evening, as he reviewed progress reports, Amber joined him in the workshop. She cradled Maverick in her arms, the infant now asleep. How's it going? She asked softly. One step at a time, Matthew replied, smiling as he gazed at his son. We're building a future for him and for every family in Amarathia. Amber leaned against him. You've always been good at seeing the bigger picture. Matthew kissed her forehead. And with you by my side, we'll keep building it together. Chapter 186. Matthew Hesh sat in the Oval Office, engrossed in a report from his chief of staff, Henry Collins. For weeks, rumors of unrest had been growing in the southern states, particularly in Georgia and Alabama. Local authorities were reporting a surge in violent protests and armed uprisings. At first, it seemed like scattered incidents over labor disputes and economic hardship, but now intelligence suggested something more coordinated. Henry, what's the full picture here? Matthew asked, his tone calm but firm. Henry sighed and placed another folder on the desk. It's worse than we thought, Mr. President. We're dealing with a combination of factors. The unrest started with labor strikes, but now it's escalated into full-scale riots in several towns. Reports indicate that a militant faction calling themselves the Southern Sovereignty League has emerged. They're using the labor movement as cover for separatist rhetoric. Matthew frowned. Separatists? I thought we dealt with those sentiments after the last civil unrest 2 decades ago. They've never fully disappeared, Henry replied. Economic disparity in the South has given these groups a platform. They're spreading propaganda that your administration's reforms are favoring the northern and western states at the expense of the South. They're calling for autonomy and are actively sabotaging railways and government facilities. Matthew leaned back in his chair, absorbing the information. How many casualties so far? 27 confirmed dead, including police officers and federal agents, Henry said grimly. Several factories and rail depots have been set on fire, and at least 3 bridges have been blown up, cutting off key transportation routes. Matthew's jaw tightened. This was worse than he had anticipated. The reforms he had introduced were meant to uplift all regions of the nation, but clearly, resentment had been festering under the surface. Now it was boiling over. Have we tried negotiating with them? Matthew asked. We've sent mediators, but they've been met with hostility, Henry answered. The League's leaders are demanding complete control over local governance and the suspension of federal laws in their territories. They're not interested in compromise. Amber entered the room quietly, sensing the tension. What's going on? She asked. Unrest in the South. Matthew explained briefly. It's turning into a full-blown crisis. Amber took a seat beside him, her expression concerned. What's your plan? Matthew stood and paced the room for a moment, gathering his thoughts. We need a multi-pronged approach. We can't let this spiral into another civil conflict, but we also can't allow separatists to undermine the federal government. Henry, contact General Hayes. I want him to prepare a rapid response force, but emphasize that we want to avoid excessive force. This isn't just a military problem, it's political and economic too. Henry nodded. Understood. Well, secure critical infrastructure first and establish control over communication lines. Good, Matthew said. Amber, as First Lady, they'll need you to coordinate with our public relations team. We need to control the narrative. If we don't, the League's propaganda will spread further. Make sure the people understand that our reforms are designed to benefit everyone. I'm on it, Amber replied. Well put out statements, hold press conferences, and highlight success stories from similar programs in other regions. Later that day, a strategy meeting took place in the White House Situation Room. General Carter Hayes presented a map with red-marked areas indicating hotspots of violence. Our primary concerns are the cities of Montgomery, Birmingham, and Savannah. The League has entrenched itself in these areas and is using guerrilla tactics to disrupt supply lines. If we don't act soon, they'll gain more ground. Matthew studied the map. What are our options, General? We can deploy federal troops to restore order, Hayes said. However, if we move too aggressively, it could backfire. Civilians caught in the crossfire will only turn against us. We need to strike a balance, secure key locations, but also engage with local leaders and labor unions. Matthew nodded. Agreed. Well, send federal troops with orders to stabilize the situation but limit confrontations where possible. At the same time, I want my administration to offer economic relief packages to the affected regions. Increased federal funding for job programs, infrastructure repair, and agricultural support could help reduce tensions. Secretary of State Johnson Wright spoke up. Mr. President, there's also an international dimension to this. Foreign powers are watching closely. If we show weakness, some of our rivals might see this as an opportunity to undermine us economically or politically. I'm well aware, Matthew said. That's why we have to resolve this quickly and decisively, without turning it into a bloodbath. Your journey continues on Novelbin. Calm in Montgomery, federal troops worked alongside local police to secure government buildings and key transportation hubs. Matthew addressed the nation through a live radio broadcast, urging unity and emphasizing his administration's commitment to improving conditions in the South. My fellow Amarathians, he began, his voice steady and reassuring. I know that many of you are frustrated. The challenges we face today are not small, but they are not insurmountable. We are one nation, united by a common dream of prosperity and opportunity. I will not abandon any part of this country. Together, we will rebuild and rise stronger than ever. The broadcast resonated with many, but tensions remained high in areas still under the League's influence. Matthew knew that public perception was crucial. He ordered Amber and his advisors to organize town hall meetings and listening sessions, where citizens could voice their concerns directly to federal representatives. Federal forces successfully dismantled key League operations without excessive casualties. Several of the League's leaders were captured and faced trial for acts of terrorism. At the same time, the administration's economic relief measures began to take effect. Farmers received loans to recover from droughts. Factories reopened with updated safety standards, and new infrastructure projects provided much-needed jobs. In Birmingham, Matthew visited one of the newly rebuilt rail depots. Workers and their families gathered to hear him speak. "I made a promise to you," he said, standing on a platform overlooking the bustling depot. "That promise was to build a better future for all Amarathians. We've faced obstacles, but we are overcoming them together. This depot is a symbol of what we can achieve when we stand united." The crowd erupted into applause. One worker approached him afterward and shook his hand. "Thank you, Mr. President. I didn't think anyone in Washington cared about us anymore, but you proved me wrong." Matthew smiled. "We're just getting started. Mr. President, the crisis is under control," he reported. "Most of the league's remnants have disbanded, and local support for federal programs is growing. Public approval of your administration has risen significantly." Matthew exhaled in relief. "Good, but let's not get complacent. We need to keep building trust and delivering results. This was a test, and we passed it, but there will be more challenges ahead." Amber, standing beside him, squeezed his hand. "You handled this crisis exactly the way you promised, through leadership and compassion. The nation believes in you." "And I believe in them," Matthew said. "Seriously, who thought that being a president would be an easy job?" Chapter 187. June 7, 1893. Matthew Hesch's day started like any other, with meetings and reports from his various departments. He was reviewing infrastructure updates when Henry Collins, his chief of staff, entered the Oval Office in a hurry. His expression was tense, a stack of papers in hand. "Mr. President, we have a situation," Henry said. Setting the papers on the desk, Matthew straightened. "What is it?" "There's been a major incident at Caledonia Steel in Pennsylvania. A worker strike escalated into a violent confrontation early this morning. Several people have been killed, and dozens more are injured. The factory is on lockdown, and reports indicate that armed union members have taken control of parts of the facility." Matthew's jaw tightened. "Caledonia Steel. That's one of the biggest suppliers of our national infrastructure project. If this isn't handled carefully, it could cripple operations across the country." Henry nodded grimly. "It gets worse. The factory owners are accusing the union leaders of inciting rebellion. The union, in turn, claims that the company's private security opened fire on unarmed workers. Public opinion is already starting to divide along political and class lines." Matthew leaned back in his chair, deep in thought. "I want the facts, no speculation. Get me General Hayes, the Secretary of Labor, and representatives from both the company and the union. We need to contain this before it spirals into a national crisis." The Situation Room buzzed with tension as key advisors and officials gathered. General Carter Hayes stood near a large map of the Caledonia Steel Complex, pointing out key areas where the conflict had broken out. "Hey, race what we know," Hayes began. "The strike was originally about unsafe working conditions and wage disputes. Negotiations broke down last week. Early this morning, a scuffle between workers and security guards escalated. Gunfire was exchanged. We have confirmed 5 dead, 2 guards, and 3 workers, about 40 others are injured." Matthew absorbed the information. "Have local authorities intervened?" "The local police are overwhelmed," Hayes replied. "The situation is volatile. If we send federal troops, it could be seen as taking sides, either for the company or the union. We risk inflaming both labor groups and business leaders. Continue your journey on Novelbin." Secretary of Labor Patricia Monroe spoke next. "Mr. President, this strike is a symptom of deeper issues. Industrial workers across the country are watching this closely. If we handle this poorly, we could see nationwide strikes. The unions are demanding justice, but business leaders are pressuring us to restore order by any means necessary." Matthew sighed, rubbing his temples. "We're standing on a knife's edge. If we're seen as favoring one side, it could destabilize the entire country." Amber entered quietly, having heard about the crisis. She gave Matthew a reassuring look before taking a seat beside him. "You'll need to balance accountability and diplomacy," she said softly. "Both sides need to feel heard." Matthew nodded, her words grounding him. He stood and addressed the room. "Hey, race, what we're going to do. First, I want a federal investigation launched immediately to determine exactly what happened. We need the truth, not propaganda from either side." He turned to Hayes. "General, Deploy a non-combat detachment to assist local authorities. Their job is to maintain order and protect lives, not to escalate the situation. Make it clear that any unnecessary use of force will not be tolerated. Hayes saluted. Understood, Mr. President. Patricia, Matthew continued, reach out to both the union and the company. Tell them I want a meeting in Washington within 48 hours. We'll negotiate a resolution here under my supervision, no more violence. Yes, Mr. President, Monroe replied. Henry spoke up, and the press? They're already running wild with the story. Hold a press briefing, Matthew ordered. Be transparent but emphasize that we're taking immediate steps to de-escalate. If we control the narrative, we can prevent further panic. June 8, 1893, Washington, D.C. The meeting between the union and company representatives took place in the Roosevelt Room of the White House. The tension was palpable. On one side sat Richard Caldwell, the CEO of Caledonia Steel. His face flushed with anger. Opposite him sat George Tate, the leader of the Steelworkers Union, who radiated defiance. Matthew entered the room and took his seat at the head of the table. Both men stood briefly out of respect, though it was clear neither wanted to be. There, gentlemen, thank you for coming, Matthew began. We are facing a crisis that threatens more than just your factory. This conflict has the potential to destabilize our entire economy. I'm here to find a solution that ensures safety, justice, and the continued progress of our nation. Caldwell spoke first, his voice sharp. Mr. President, these workers have gone too far. They've taken over my property, destroyed equipment, and endangered lives. This is nothing short of domestic terrorism. Tate immediately fired back. That's a lie. We were peacefully striking until your hired thugs opened fire on us. Our people are tired of being treated like expendable machines. We demand safe working conditions and fair wages. Matthew raised his hand, silencing both men. I understand your frustrations, but this bickering won't solve anything. We need facts. The federal investigation is underway, and those responsible for any unlawful actions, whether they're guards or workers, will be held accountable. He turned to Caldwell. Mr. Caldwell, I understand your concerns about property damage, but you must acknowledge the legitimate grievances of your workers. Safety standards at your facility have been criticized for years. Caldwell scowled but remained silent. Matthew then addressed Tate. Mr. Tate, your people have every right to demand better conditions. However, seizing the factory and escalating the conflict will only undermine your cause. I need your cooperation to bring this to a peaceful resolution. Tate sighed, nodding reluctantly. We want peace, Mr. President, but we also want justice. You'll have both, Matthew promised. Raise my proposal. We'll establish a joint commission to oversee safety improvements at Caledonia Steel. Wages will be renegotiated under federal mediation in return. The union must end the occupation and resume normal operations. The room fell silent as both sides considered the offer. After a tense moment, Caldwell spoke. If it's under federal oversight, I can agree to that. Tate exchanged a glance with his advisors before nodding. We'll cooperate, but only if there's real accountability. Done, Matthew said, standing. Now let's restore order and move forward. June 10, 1893, the crisis at Caledonia Steel began to de-escalate. Federal investigators arrived on site, and both the union and company leaders honored the terms of the agreement. News of the peaceful resolution spread across the nation, bolstering Matthew's reputation as a leader who could handle both business and labor disputes with fairness. At a press conference, Matthew addressed the nation. This crisis showed us the importance of balance between growth and justice, between progress and human dignity. We are stronger when we work together. Let this be a lesson for all of us. Chapter 188. April 16, 1893, the meeting room inside the White House was tense. Matthew Hesh sat at the head of the table. His top advisors and foreign policy experts gathered around him. News had just arrived from Asia, and it wasn't good. Henry Collins, Matthew's chief of staff, spoke first. Mr. President, we have a developing situation in East Asia. The Empire of Japan has issued an ultimatum to China over territorial disputes regarding the island of Formosa. Matthew leaned forward, his expression darkening. Formosa, that's a critical trade route. Any escalation there could disrupt the shipping lanes we depend on. Amber, who had joined the meeting as an informal advisor, nodded. It's not just about trade routes. If Japan takes control of Formosa, they'll strengthen their dominance in the region, and other nations might challenge them. This could lead to a full-scale conflict. Matthew rubbed his temples. What's the current state of both militaries? General Carter Hayes cleared his throat and opened a folder. Japan has been modernizing rapidly over the past few decades. They've modeled their military after Western powers. Their navy, in particular, is becoming a formidable force. Meanwhile, the Chinese military is still fractured and reliant on outdated strategies and equipment. If a war breaks out, Japan will have the upper hand. And where does that leave us? Matthew asked. Secretary of State Johnson Wright spoke up. Right now, our position is delicate. We have trade agreements with both Japan and China. However, most of our exports, especially Hesh Industries equipment and goods, rely on stable shipping routes in the Pacific. If war disrupts those routes, our economy could take a serious hit. Matthew sighed. What's Japan's justification for this ultimatum? They claim Chinese pirates operating out of Formosa have attacked their merchants. Wright explained they're using it as a pretext for military action. However, most intelligence suggests this is part of a broader strategy by Japan to expand their influence in East Asia. Matthew stood and began pacing. If we openly side with China, Japan will see us as an enemy. If we support Japan's expansion, well, alienate China. Either way, we're risking our foothold in Asia. Hayes spoke again. There's a third option, Mr. President. We could try to mediate the conflict, offer both sides diplomatic talks under Amarathian oversight. Matthew stopped pacing. Mediation that could work, but only if both sides are willing to talk. Wright nodded. It's a gamble, but it might be the best way to maintain stability. If we can bring Japan and China to the negotiating table, we can protect our interests while presenting Amarathia as a global power capable of diplomacy. Matthew took a deep breath, considering the options. All right, let's begin preparations for mediation. Johnson, I want formal invitations sent to both the Japanese and Chinese governments. Offer Washington as a neutral ground for talks. Make it clear that maintaining peace in the region benefits everyone. Understood, Mr. President, Wright said. General Hayes added, we should also increase our naval presence in the Pacific, just in case. We don't want either side thinking we're unprepared. Agreed, Matthew replied, but keep it discreet. This is a diplomatic mission first and foremost. April 22, 1893. Word came back swiftly from Asia. The Chinese government, desperate to avoid war, accepted the offer for mediation. The Japanese response, however, was more cautious. While they agreed to attend the talks, their ambassador made it clear that Japan would not back down easily. Days later, both delegations arrived in Washington. The atmosphere was tense as diplomats from both nations gathered in the White House's East Wing. The Amarathian press eagerly covered the historic event, dubbing it the Washington Summit. Matthew presided over the opening session. He stood at the center of the Grand Hall, flanked by his advisors and security. Gentlemen, he began, addressing both delegations, the world is watching. We are here today to prevent a war that could destabilize an entire region and harm countless lives. I urge both sides to approach these talks with an open mind and a willingness to compromise. The Japanese ambassador, a stern-faced man named Yamamoto Ichiro, bowed slightly. President Hesh, Japan appreciates your invitation. However, we will not allow continued attacks on our people and commerce. The Chinese representative, Minister Zhao Wenliang, countered, Japan's accusations are exaggerated. The situation in Formosa is complex, but it does not justify military invasion. Matthew raised a hand, signaling for calm. This is why we're here to find a solution that avoids bloodshed. Let's start by discussing the specific incidents that led to this dispute. For hours, both sides debated fiercely. Matthew intervened when tensions threatened to boil over, reminding the delegations of the stakes involved. Slowly, common ground began to emerge. By the second day of talks, an outline for a possible agreement was on the table. Japan would scale back its military presence near Formosa in exchange for joint anti-piracy patrols conducted with Chinese cooperation. Additionally, Formosa would be granted semi-autonomous status under a framework supervised by both nations, reducing the risk of further conflict. April 28, 1893, the Washington Summit concluded with a formal agreement signed by both delegations. News of the peace accord spread quickly, with newspapers praising Matthew's leadership. President Hesh secures peace in Asia. One headline declared, another read, Amarathia emerges as diplomatic power. In a press conference, Matthew addressed the nation. This agreement is a victory for diplomacy and cooperation. It proves that through dialogue, we can resolve even the most challenging disputes. Let this be a testament to our commitment to peace and stability, not just for Amarathia, but for the world. That evening, Matthew returned to the White House residence, exhausted but relieved. Amber greeted him with a warm smile. Stay tuned to Novelbin. Calm, you did it, she said softly. You prevented a war. Let's hope it holds, Matthew replied, sinking into a chair. These things are fragile, one wrong move and everything could unravel. Amber sat beside him. You've shown the world what kind of leader you are, someone who doesn't just build factories and railways but also builds bridges between nations. Matthew smiled faintly. I couldn't have done it without you and the team. Now it's time to focus on our own nation again. As the lights of Washington shimmered outside the window, Matthew knew that the challenges ahead would be just as daunting as the ones he had already faced, but for now there was peace, and that was a victory worth savoring. Chapter 189. The morning of March 10, 1893 started like any other. The streets of Washington buzzed with the sound of automobiles and street vendors. Matthew Hesh sat in the Oval Office, reviewing reports on infrastructure projects when a messenger burst in unexpectedly, followed closely by Henry Collins, his chief of staff. Mr. President, Collins said urgently, motioning for the messenger to step forward. We've got a developing crisis. The messenger, pale and visibly shaken, handed over a telegram. This just came from the health department in Chicago, sir. There's been an outbreak of a strange disease, and it's spreading fast. Matthew took the telegram, his eyes scanning the hastily written words. Unidentified illness reported. Symptoms include high fever, large black boils on the skin, rapid organ failure, over 300 dead within the past 3 days. Fear of further spread imminent. Request immediate federal support. Matthew lowered the paper and frowned. Boils? Rapid deaths? This sounds medieval, like the Black Plague. That's exactly what the Chicago officials are afraid of, Collins said grimly. Doctors are baffled. They're calling it Black Death Reborn. The first cases were reported near the docks last week. It seems to be spreading through crowded areas, especially markets and factories. Is it isolated to Chicago? Matthew asked, leaning forward. No, sir, there are similar reports from nearby cities like St. Louis and Detroit. The symptoms match. If we don't act fast, it could sweep through the entire country. Matthew nodded slowly. All right, let's gather the experts. I want a full report on this disease and potential containment measures. We can't risk panic spreading faster than the illness. Doctors, scientists, and public health officials crowded into the White House conference room. The atmosphere was tense as Dr. Frederick Hall, the head of Amarathia's Public Health Service, stepped forward to brief the president. Mr. President, we're facing a highly contagious and deadly disease. The incubation period appears to be 2 to 3 days, and once symptoms appear, victims deteriorate rapidly. Most die within 48 hours. What about transmission? Matthew asked, his expression hardening. Based on initial findings, it spreads through direct contact with bodily fluids, but there's also evidence suggesting airborne transmission in crowded areas. We've identified several hot zones in Chicago, Detroit, and St. Louis. Our hospitals are overwhelmed. Amber, seated at the table as an advisor, interjected, do we have any treatments? Hall shook his head. None that are effective so far. Standard fever treatments aren't working. The only option we have is containment, isolating the infected and enforcing strict quarantines. Matthew sighed deeply. Quarantines, you realize how disruptive this will be? Factories, trade routes, entire cities could shut down. There'll be riots if people think they're being abandoned. Henry Collins spoke up. That's why we need a coordinated response. If this gets out of control, we're looking at economic collapse and millions of deaths. Matthew nodded grimly. Then we don't have a choice. Well, implement emergency protocols immediately. Hall, work with regional health departments to organize quarantine zones. Henry, I want regular updates from every major city affected. Mobilize the National Guard if necessary to enforce public safety. By the next morning, newspapers across the country ran alarming headlines. Deadly plague grips Amarathian cities. Black boils and death, a nation in panic. President Hesh declares national health emergency. As expected, panic set in. Citizens flooded train stations and ports, desperate to flee infected cities. However, this only worsened the situation as travelers carried the disease to previously unaffected regions. By the end of the week, cases were reported as far south as New Orleans and as far west as Denver. Matthew watched grimly as footage from the crisis zones played on the screens in his office. Makeshift hospitals overflowed with the dead, and dying mass graves were being dug in. Chicago's outskirts, doctors and nurses in protective gear worked tirelessly, though many of them fell ill as well. Amber entered the room, carrying a steaming cup of tea. Matthew, you've barely slept, she said softly, placing the cup on his desk. You need to rest, even for a few hours. I can't. he muttered, rubbing his temples. This is spiraling out of control. Every strategy we put in place is being overwhelmed. You're doing everything you can, Amber assured him. But you can't carry this alone. You've got a whole team of experts who can help. Lean on them. No, even the experts' only best solution is containment. We have to invent a cure if we have to, Matthew replied. A cure? Don't tell me, Matthew, there must be a limit to what you can invent. I can understand it if it's related to machines or any contraptions, but medicine, that's out of your expertise. No, Matthew shook his head. This is just basic science. What we need is an antibiotic. Antibiotic, Amber repeated, unfamiliar with the word, since it hasn't existed yet. What is that? An antibiotic is a medicine that fights infections caused by bacteria, which could stop bacterial infections from spreading and save lives. And how are you going to make it? Amber asked. I am going to need the help of our scientist. Matthew didn't finish his thought as Henry Collins rushed in with another telegram in hand. His face was pale and tense. Mr. President, urgent news from Chicago and Detroit. Entire districts have gone into chaos. Riots have broken out over the quarantines. The National Guard reports that armed groups are attacking medical centers, claiming the disease is a hoax designed to suppress the working class. Matthew clenched his jaw. They're attacking the very people trying to save them? Damn it. This is what I feared. Amber placed a hand on his arm, her eyes full of concern. Matthew, this is escalating on all fronts. If this disease isn't contained soon, the social order could collapse. Matthew nodded and stood abruptly. All right, this has to end now. We'll split our efforts into two fronts. One for public order and one for finding a cure. Henry, contact Earl. I want every scientist in this nation mobilized, university researchers, pharmaceutical developers, anyone with expertise in bacteriology and chemistry. We're not just containing this disease, we're going to cure it. Collins nodded. Understood, sir. I'll also coordinate with the governors in the affected states to deploy additional guard units. Good. We also need to address these conspiracy theories. I'll make a public address tonight to calm the nation. Amber, you'll help me draft the speech. I need to reassure the people while also making it clear that these riots are putting everyone's lives at risk. Amber gave a firm nod. I'm on it. That evening, the nation gathered around radios and newspaper offices to hear the president's message. Inside the White House broadcast room, Matthew adjusted his tie and took a deep breath before stepping up to the microphone. The red light flicked on, signaling the start of the address. My fellow Amarathians, he began somberly, we face a crisis unlike any in our history. An illness has swept through our cities, claiming the lives of thousands. I know you are afraid. I know many of you have lost loved ones, but I am here to tell you that we will overcome this together. He paused for a moment, letting the weight of his words settle. Your journey continues at Novelbin. Calm, however, we cannot allow fear and misinformation to destroy what we have built. Riots and attacks on medical centers only hinder our efforts to save lives. This disease is real and it is deadly, but so too is our resolve. I have ordered the deployment of the National Guard to protect our hospitals and ensure that those in need receive care. Matthew's tone shifted to one of hope and determination. I have also mobilized the brightest minds in our nation to find a cure. Together, we will develop the tools needed to defeat this disease, but I ask for your cooperation. Follow the guidance of your local health authorities. Support your neighbors. We must stand united in this fight. As he spoke, families huddled together in homes across the country, listening intently. In Chicago, where rioters had clashed with guardsmen earlier that day, the crowd around a radio went quiet. Some of the agitators lowered their weapons, their anger tempered by the president's words. Chapter 190. The next morning, March 11, 1893, Matthew Hesh convened an emergency council at the White House. Doctors, researchers, and scientific advisors from across the nation filled the room. Among them was Dr. Frederick Hall, head of the Public Health Service, along with prominent chemists and microbiologists. The atmosphere was tense as they awaited the president's directive. Matthew entered and took his seat at the head of the table. He wasted no time. Ladies and gentlemen, the nation is in crisis. He began, containment measures are buying us time, but they won't solve the core problem. We need a cure. I believe the solution lies in developing an antibiotic. Specifically, I want us to create a compound capable of killing bacterial infections. The room fell into a stunned silence. Dr. Hall adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat. Mr. President, with all due respect, we haven't identified the cause of this disease yet. We're still investigating whether it's bacterial or viral. And antibiotics, as you describe, are, well, speculative at best. There's no precedent for what you're suggesting. Matthew nodded, expecting the skepticism. You're right, Dr. Hall, but consider the symptoms like high fever, skin boils, and organ failure point toward a severe bacterial infection. We've seen similar patterns in past epidemics, such as anthrax and pneumonic plague. If that's the case, antibiotics could halt the spread. Read exclusive chapters at NovelBin.com. Dr. Leonard Perry, a biochemist, leaned forward. Even if you're correct, developing a new medicine of this nature would take years under normal circumstances. We'd need to isolate the pathogen, test compounds, and ensure safety before deployment. Then we'll have to accelerate the process, Matthew replied firmly. We don't have years, we have weeks, if not days, to prevent a total collapse of society. I've already initiated a nationwide mobilization of scientific resources. I'm authorizing emergency funding and full access to any equipment you need. But I need your cooperation. A younger researcher, Dr. Eleanor Hart, spoke up. Mr. President, do you have any specific ideas on where to start? You seem remarkably confident for someone without a medical background. Matthew hesitated for a moment, carefully choosing his words. He couldn't reveal that he possessed knowledge from a future where antibiotics were common. He needed a believable justification. I've spent years working closely with industrial chemists and researchers, he began. During that time, I learned that certain natural substances have antimicrobial properties, mold and fungi, for example. Historical records even mention ancient practices of using moldy bread to treat wounds. We need to explore that angle. Dr. Hall's eyes narrowed in thought. Mold-based compounds? You're referring to what some herbalists and folk healers have experimented with. It's unconventional, but not without merit. Matthew pressed on. Precisely, I want teams focused on analyzing molds and fungi, look for strains that inhibit bacterial growth, also conduct parallel research to identify the pathogen behind the outbreak. We need both efforts running simultaneously. The room buzzed with cautious discussion. Some scientists expressed doubts, while others acknowledged that extraordinary measures were necessary under the circumstances. Finally, Dr. Hall nodded. Very well, Mr. President. They'll coordinate the research teams. We'll start with fungal samples and bacterial cultures, but I'll be honest, it's a long shot. Matthew stood and addressed the entire council. I understand the risks, but long shots are better than no shots. We're fighting for the survival of this nation. Let's make history. Over the following week, laboratories across Amarathia launched an unprecedented research effort. Samples of various molds were collected from hospitals, food storage facilities, and even nature reserves. Researchers worked around the clock, testing their effects on bacterial cultures extracted from infected patients. Matthew kept a close eye on the progress. Daily reports streamed into the White House. Amber often found him poring over scientific journals and lab data late into the night. You're pushing yourself too hard, she said one evening, bringing him a cup of coffee. You can't carry all of this on your shoulders. Matthew glanced up from his papers and gave a tired smile. If I don't push, who will? We're on the verge of something revolutionary, Amber. This could save millions not just now, but for generations to come. She placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. You're not alone. You've got brilliant minds working with you. Trust them. On May 5th, the breakthrough came. Mr. President, this could be the breakthrough we've been waiting for. If this compound proves effective and safe, we may have a viable treatment. Matthew leaned forward, gripping the edge of his desk. Then let's waste no time. Begin preparing for human trials immediately. I want updates every few hours. This is our top priority. Understood, Hall and Hart confirmed in unison before the line went silent. The following day, May 5th, the first human trial was ready to begin. The team in Chicago selected a critically ill patient named Joseph Langston, a dockworker who had been among the first infected. His condition had deteriorated rapidly, and doctors believed he had mere days if not hours left to live. Matthew followed the situation closely from Washington. Dr. Hall's report came in just before noon. We're about to administer the first dose, Mr. President. We'll monitor him closely over the next 24 hours. Matthew nodded through the telegraph exchange, his thoughts racing. I trust your team, Dr. Hall. Keep me informed of every development. The nation is watching. In the hospital ward in Chicago, doctors and nurses gathered around Joseph's bedside. Dr. Hart carefully injected the experimental compound into his arm. The room was silent except for the steady beeping of monitoring equipment. His breathing was labored, his skin pale and clammy. The waiting began. By nightfall, initial signs of improvement emerged. Langston's fever began to drop and his breathing steadied, though still unconscious. He appeared more stable than he had been in days. The team cautiously documented every change, sending hourly updates to the White House at 4 a.m. On May 6th. A message from Dr. Hall arrived at the president's residence, patient stabilizing. Fever down 40, initial test shows immune response improving. Will proceed with next dose.